When the recent Pixar movie Elemental came out, I got really excited because it seemed from the trailer that it was going to be a love story, but more importantly, an immigrant love story. And what I was surprised by was that it was a really subtle movie with perhaps some of the most important experiences of what it's like to grow up as an immigrant, especially in North America, and what it feels like growing up in a foreign land and the sacrifices we make along the way. As someone who was also a first-generation immigrant, the movie felt like it was made for me. And it was almost shockingly familiar. Throughout this video, I want to go through some of the hidden moments in which the movie showcases things like invisible racial struggles, microaggressions, the secret struggle of what it means to be the child of an immigrant. In one of the early scenes of the movie, we see how the characters are constantly running into these small racial experiences. Even when the two main characters of the parents first arrive into the country, they run into the first experience that many immigrants run into, which is when the custom agent at the gate tries to pronounce their names, they struggle, and instead they give them a name and says, "Why don't we call you Bernie and Cinder instead?" This kind of experience is oftentimes known as the perpetual foreigner syndrome, which is one of the first ways in which immigrants are often subjugated to trying to get whitewashed. And instead of being taught that they can learn a new name, they're often pressured to adopt more Western sounding names. And as a result, face this kind of subtle prejudice. This is something that many of us have gone through. In such an example that was recently discussed by Harvard Business School, they found that Black and Asian applicants who were applying for jobs often found it a lot easier to get a callback from their employer if they found a way to hide their ethnicity. Oftentimes they do this by changing their last name or even try to reference it in a different way. When this kind of things happened, oftentimes African and Asian American applicants found that when they were able to whitewash their applications, they saw a massive increase in the number of callbacks that they got, starting with Asian Americans who saw an increase from about 10% to about 21% of callbacks, and African Americans seeing from 10% all the way to 25% in terms of callbacks. Now, when you really think about this, it's not a surprise why it is that so many people feel the need to hide who they are in order to be better accepted. Another example of this is shown later on when Ember, the main character, goes to visit Wade Ripple's home. Now, in this situation, Wade Ripple definitely seems like more of the quote-unquote majority character, given the fact that the city seems mostly dominated by water people. In this situation, it is assumed that Wade's culture is perhaps more westernized. And there's this moment, for example, when they're sitting around where one of Wade's family members, who was talking to Ember at the time, says,
"Just have to say that you speak so well and clear."
This once again is a demonstration of how these little small immigrant expectations, like the fact that you're not supposed to be, speaking English despite the fact that it might be your first language, because once again, there is the expectation that because you look like a foreigner, therefore you are different from the rest of us. Now, little details abound throughout this entire movie. We see Ember having to pull out an umbrella and is reminded of the fact that the city isn't built for people like me in mind. It's a constant reminder that assimilation plays a vast role in the lives of any immigrants. We are expected to hide our culture so as to not be too much of an inconvenience to others because the expectation is that we are not here first. This is understandable to a degree, but it seems like there is always some kind of reference or some kind of reminder of our difference. A major part of the movie comes down to Ember trying to deal with her father's own racial discriminations, blaming water for everything that goes wrong. This is something that Ember even takes advantage of when she makes a mistake and as a result creates a massive leak in her own basement. Instead of acknowledging the fact that she made a mistake and the fact that, she may have cost her own father's business, she instead blames all water people for having made the same mistake. The struggle of interracial relationships is a big one, and we start to see that apparently on both sides. Ember's mother, Cinder, refers to how her own parent was dying and was reminding her that she is required to marry fire. And fortunately, Cinder is much more understanding, as later on, when she sees that the love is real and recognizes that love is love, she becomes more protective of her daughter, and the fact that their relationship that she has with Wade seems to be much more significant. This doesn't change the fact that for a lot of people, interracial relationships to this day still carries a lot of prejudice and discrimination. And this is still consistently shown throughout the story. When Bernie and Cinder are walking down the street, they're called racial names like Sparky, or the fact that we see them constantly dealing with having their fire put out as a result of being around water. The fact that water and fire is seen as not supposed to be able to be matched together is a major one, until we see Wade and Ember connect for the first time and realizing that As a matter of fact, their connection is really not as bad as they thought it was going to be. One of the most prominent themes of the story, however, is that of parental expectations and sacrifice. This is something that we see as intergenerational trauma. We often think that one of the common struggles of immigrant parenting experience is about how strict parents are. And while that does often happen, in the movie we actually see how even positive influences and expectations can create a negative result. In the story, Bernie only seems to give his daughter approval or compliments when she does things that fulfill the role and the family role that he wants, namely to take over the store. He calls her a good daughter when she is acting more like him, beating his records, when it comes to delivering things or taking care of the shop. Throughout the story, the love that Ember craves so deeply from her father is almost always wrapped up in expectation and duty. So there's always this condition that she needed to do better, stay calm, put the shop first, and hide what it is that she truly wants, because the expectation is that anything that she wants does not help the family and is therefore almost seen as a betrayal of her parents' sacrifices. There is a strong emphasis on the idea of sacrifice throughout the story. When Ember finally realizes that she doesn't actually want to run her father's shop, she's faced with a deep internal struggle. In a critical scene, she realized that all she wanted to be was good enough. And in this particular quote, she says, "All I wanted to do was be good enough to fill my father's shoes," but she was never asked what she wanted to do.
I never once asked.
This scene is so critical because when she says deep down it wouldn't matter, is because she always grew up seeing how much sacrifice her parents made for her. So as a result, that quote,
"The only way to repay a sacrifice so big is by sacrificing your life too,"
is something that really personally hit me hard. Because something that I personally saw not only in the lives of so many other children of immigrants, but growing up, my parents' way of showing love wasn't by saying I love you, words of affirmation, or through physical affection. Instead, it was always shown through sacrifice and how hard they worked, how oftentimes they would cut back on buying things that they wanted so they could provide me with a better education. So as a result, I always felt like I had to carry this deep debt that I could never truly repay unless I had sacrificed as much as or more than they have. And this is where we see also her father's own generational trauma when he was growing up. We see that he was working and felt like he was a burden that he had to carry, and the reminder that we never forgot that we are fire. And that burden of lineage, of culture, of the heritage is passed on from one generation to the other, and always teaching them that no matter who you are, you always had to sacrifice yourself and to sacrifice everything you have. And that's why it is that when the father eventually finds out that not only was his daughter dating somebody from a different, let's say, community, but also the fact that the father recognized that she didn't want to carry on the family career, there was this deep disappointment because the family trauma and that generational trauma being passed down to his daughter was always based on the idea that he also wanted to be a good father. And for him, being a good father is being a good son to his own father. For any child, unconditional love is deeply important. And if we don't get it, we spend our entire lives trying to sacrifice ourselves to fight for it, even when it doesn't make sense anymore. And this is why that final scene in the movie reveals something so beautiful and healing. It was when Ember's father told her that the shop wasn't the dream, that she was the dream.
The shop was never the dream. You were the dream.
Because it gave her the permission to stop having to keep sacrificing herself. It was such a touching scene that for me, when I was watching it, I realized it was something that I wish I had from my own parents. To be reminded that we don't have to keep sacrificing ourselves and give ourselves up to make their sacrifices worth it. So I would love to hear, how did you feel about the movie? Did you like it? Did you find it reflective of your own experiences? Let me know in the comments below.